So both of us watched Godzilla Minus One this month, but since we already did a video focused just on that movie, we're not going to talk about it in this video.
All right, so what else did you watch in this last month of 2023?
I watched Half a Loaf of Kung Fu, which was a Jackie Chan movie from 1978. This is early on in his starring career, and it definitely feels pretty rough for what you think of as a Jackie Chan movie. He's clearly not the one in charge yet, but he is at least trying to kind of start the kind of persona that you think of as a Jackie Chan persona, because he kind of plays the same character in every movie, at least the non-Hollywood ones. So in here, he is goofy, and it is very comedic, but part of the problem is that it's not very funny. It's supposed to be, but it's just not. So the plot, he even plays kind of a dick character. He's a liar, he's a thief, he impersonates people that he just saw get murdered for personal advantage. So he tries to pretend that he's really good at Kung Fu and, I don't know, wants to get a job as a bodyguard, I think, for some royalty or something. I honestly was not keeping track of the plot because it did not matter in this movie, and there were way too many characters, but the main idea is the people that he's working for, or trying to work for, they have some kind of MacGuffins that everybody else wants, so a bunch of different people are kind of fighting to try to get them. It doesn't even matter what they are, I don't even remember. So along the way, Jackie Chan has to pretend that he knows how to fight. It kind of tries to do the stereotypical Kung Fu movie arc of him not knowing how to fight and kind of learning from people along the way. So you have a few people that pop in and teach him some things, but again, given that it's kind of trying to be funny, like one of those characters, his gimmick is that he always farts, but there's nothing funny about that by default. You have to make it funny, and the movie didn't. So it was kind of dumb. Jackie Chan being an unlikable character was weird, and by the end of the movie, he hasn't actually learned very much along the way, but he just, I guess, can fight by the end just because that's the movie. For anyone who's not a hardcore Jackie Chan fan, I would say definitely do not bother with this one. And for people that are, I would honestly still say, like, I could never imagine wanting to watch this movie again. It was not great.
I'm trying to think of a good joke having to do with the half a loaf, but I can't.
I mean, see, that title is supposed to, I mean, I guess, I don't know, maybe it's funny in Chinese. In English, it just feels like, oh, look at that dumb title. And it doesn't make sense, just like the movie. I watched Leave the World Behind, which is a Netflix original movie from 2023. So this was clearly an attempt by Netflix to replicate the success of Bird Box and Don't Look Up, and both of those were terrible, and so is this one. So the idea is Julia Roberts and Ethan Hawke play a couple that take their kids to, they rent a house for like a vacation, and when they go on their vacation, weird stuff starts happening. They start losing connection with the internet.
So it's a horror movie.
I mean, it's about the end of the world, just like those two other movies were. But it treats it so stupidly, and it doesn't help that these characters are so dumb and unlikable. And in particular, Ethan Hawke is the type of character that I've been seeing a lot in modern movies. I think of like Us as a good example, where the father figure, everybody else kind of expects him to protect them, but he doesn't. He's kind of inept and incompetent and doesn't take things seriously. And I just find that type of character very irritating.
So what you're saying is Ethan Hawke plays himself.
I knew you were going to say that. Nick has some kind of personal vendetta against Ethan Hawke. I guess he owes him money or something. I don't know.
He still owes me for helping to make him taller. You saw that movie, that documentary about it?
So while they're in this house and they're losing connection with things, this father and daughter show up claiming to be the owners of the house because they've never actually met in person. They just communicated over email. And Julia Roberts is very skeptical. Ethan Hawke is like, hey, let's let them in. They can sleep, like whatever. And she's like, yeah, we don't know who these people are.
Yeah, they sound dumb already.
Yeah, and also the father and daughter are black, so there's like a race angle to it too, which honestly is probably the thing that the movie handled the best, and it was still really stupid. Over the course of the movie, weird stuff keeps happening. They see, Ethan Hawke sees like a plane that's dropping flyers that say something in Arabic, which the son claims says like death to America or something. And animals keep acting weird. I mean, the way they try to set things up is so incredibly stupid. And this is based on a book. I don't know how close to the book it actually is, but there were a few moments that made me laugh out loud. And one of them was a scene where a bunch of deer are surrounding a person, one of the characters.
Are these real deer or CGI deer?
No, these are very CGI deer, which was part of why it was funny already. So in real life, if you don't know why this is happening, and to be clear also, in the movie, it does not make sense. Even in the context of the movie, there is no reason for these animals to be doing this. But for some reason, they're all surrounding this person, and it's supposed to be really scary and tense. But when you cut from a shot of the person looking scared, and then you cut to some CGI deer that are literally just standing there staring blankly, it's not scary, it's funny. The movie doesn't really have a climax. It feels like it's building to something, and the ending is one of the worst parts. It just kind of ends. It's just done. It's like, that's the movie, because we couldn't figure out where to go. So the closest thing to a climax is the scene with the deer. And there's other stuff happening at the same time, too. So when I'm laughing at the point that's supposed to be the biggest point of the movie, that's not a good sign. There was one other moment in particular that made me laugh a lot, where the owner of the house is talking to Julia Roberts. Throughout the movie, he keeps throwing out these cryptic hints of, oh, I knew something was coming. And then they'll ask him, like, why? What did you know? And he's like, oh, I probably shouldn't say anything. And then it just goes to the next scene. And he says things like, oh, I had a friend that was selling all his stocks, so I knew something was coming. It was like the guy in Bird Box that keeps saying, like, oh, they must be demons from, like, whatever. And then, he dies, so you don't actually find out any information. It's kind of like that. You're supposed to assume, because it's a movie, that he's telling the truth, that he's right, but he doesn't actually tell you anything that you couldn't have already figured out just from watching the movie. But there's a scene where he's talking to Julia Roberts and he's giving one of his cryptic reveals or whatever. There's a musical cue. It's supposed to be like a stinger, but it's so stupid, and I just could not stop laughing. So he says something like, I have friends that are part of an inner circle that control the workings of the country, or something like that, something stupid. And then it cuts to Julia Roberts, and the music, I can't remember exactly what it does, but it's like, dun-dun-dun-dun. And it like just comes out of nowhere, and it doesn't fit at all. And it was really funny. I could not stop laughing. I had to go back and watch that multiple times because it was so funny. And the people that were making the movie, it seemed like they must have just figured out how to do overhead shots. I don't know if they're using a crane or a drone or something.
No, maybe they said, well, we don't need cranes because we have drones, so we're going to do a lot of them because it'll make it look really fancy.
Probably. They clearly thought it was really cool because they did it a lot, and they did it in places where it does not make sense and is mostly just distracting. And again, I don't know how close to the book it is, but it felt like the writers had an idea for an end-of-the-world situation, but they didn't actually do real-world research on what would happen and how it would affect things. And they just decided to kind of write it anyway. And for a situation like that, you need characters that are experiencing this. But the characters in this movie, it feels like that's all they thought about. We just need some characters. They don't have any kind of arcs. Again, the race angle is the closest thing to an arc that there is in the movie, and that's not what the movie's about. And they're not interesting at all. And nothing happens to them that's interesting in terms of them as people. It's just them kind of reacting to everything that's going on around them. And what's going on around them is so vague and uninteresting. So yeah, it's a really stupid movie with really dumb characters. If you liked Bird Box or Don't Look Up, you'll probably like this, which is unfortunate because it was the #1 movie on Netflix or whatever. So that's great. I watched Crybaby Lane, which was a Nickelodeon original movie from 2000. The reason I watched this, I read that it had supposedly, and it turned out this was not correct, that it had only aired once back in the day, and parents complained so much that it was too scary or whatever that they never aired it again. Again, not true. It has aired multiple times since then. It had a decent urban legend kind of setup where I was surprised they got Frank Langella. Frank Langella was telling these kids this story about a pair of twins that were born back in the day where one of them was evil or whatever. And I can't remember why they died, but they meant to bury the good kid in the cemetery and the bad kid, like, tossed him in a pit or something. I can't remember. But they accidentally swapped the bodies. So the bad kid was in the cemetery. And then somehow these kids are playing some kind of prank or something, and they accidentally resurrect this kid or his ghost because he starts possessing people. The story that Frank Langella tells was not bad. It was a good setup. But the rest of the movie was a pretty typical late 90s, early 2000s kids TV movie. I can see why parents, especially at the time, would complain, but there really wasn't a whole lot to it. It was what you would expect from a Nickelodeon original movie from the time. I did notice Jim Gaffigan in a very small role, so this must have been early in his acting roles, and it was not a comedy role either, so that was a little weird. I watched The Wicker Man from 1973, which is a movie that both of us really like. I must have forgotten how much singing there is in that movie, how many songs, because I remember the one in the bar or in the inn or whatever about the guy's daughter.
Yeah, it's practically a musical.
Yeah, there was so much singing in that movie. I forgot about the theme that's with like oh man, I can't remember now, the barleycorns or whatever. I hate that theme so much. And of course, it plays a lot. I had also forgotten that, and this is maybe my one complaint, other than maybe there's a little too much singing. I didn't remember that they threw in like all the weird like sex stuff so early in the movie. I feel like it would have been a little better if the main guy gradually realized how weird this community is, instead of kind of throwing it right up front like that. Basically, the main character is a devout Christian police officer that is visiting this island that turns out to be inhabited by this pagan cult, and he's trying to investigate the disappearance of a young girl. And everybody there claims that they don't know who she was and nothing ever happened, but it's very clear that they do, that there's some kind of conspiracy afoot. So it's weird, it's creepy. I do think the fact that they do put everything up front and they don't try to hide it does make it creepier, but for the sake of the movie, I think it would have been better if they kind of built up to it a little bit more. But it is a really good movie. Christopher Lee has some weird hair in this movie. If you enjoyed Midsummer as a newer horror movie, that movie takes a lot of inspiration from The Wicker Man. I would say it's almost entirely trying to do like a new version of The Wicker Man, and they're both really good.
Mm-hmm.
You talked about The Killing of Satan from 1983.
Yeah.
So we both watched it this time, and it was really good. There were parts of it that were kind of boring, kind of slow, but the goofy stuff definitely made it worth it. Very over the top, very ridiculous. So you can check out this video if you want to hear more about that movie.
Wow, look how professional we've become. You can link to other videos that we've already talked about.
Yeah, we'll see if I get the right thumbnail. I watched The Mighty Boosh Season 1, which was from 2004. This one's going to be hard to describe. So this is a British comedy show. Have you ever heard of this?
Yeah.
If I say that it's about a pair of guys that work at a zoo, I mean, that's technically true, but most of the episodes kind of go all over the place and have nothing to do with that. It's very surreal and goofy and over the top and ridiculous, but some of the writing, there's a really smart dialogue exchanges between characters, and that's actually what I like about it the most, more so than all the weird, goofy, almost dreamlike stuff that they stick in there. Very ridiculous, very over the top. I don't personally get when everybody says that British humor is very dry, because I feel like British humor, in my experience, and this is why I avoid British humor a lot of the time, to me it feels like it's going for a lowest common denominator and it's just very stupid. And maybe I'm just watching the wrong stuff, I don't know. But this does have some really smart jokes. I've talked about this before, but I prefer humor that doesn't bring attention to itself. And there are a lot of jokes in here that just kind of go by and you just keep watching. And that's the kind of stuff that I like. So you do have the really goofy stuff for the people that might not get those jokes, I guess. And it's still, yeah, I like it. It's really funny. The reason I watched this was because it's some of the same people involved as Garth Marenghi's Dark Place, but it's very different from that show. I would recommend it to people that enjoyed that, even if it is very different. It's really hard to describe without just saying, go watch an episode. And even then, the first episode I feel like was relatively normal, and I was not expecting it to get so crazy from then on. And a lot of the episodes also have kind of like a musical number at the end, which is interesting. It's almost like an entire music video. So it's clear that the people making it were having a lot of fun. And I don't know, you either vibe with it or you don't. I would say check out an episode to see if you do. Have you watched any of it or just heard of it?
I've just heard of it.
Okay. I read Showcase Presents House of Mystery Volume 2, which covers House of Mystery issues from October 1971 to February 1973. So it's a horror anthology comic. You're going to get a lot of variety. I thought this volume was a lot better than Volume 1, partially because this is when DC started bringing in a lot of Filipino artists, and a lot of those were really good. And also the Comics Code was easing their restrictions on supernatural stuff and violence and stuff like that. So they were a little freer to kind of do what they wanted to do. I assume it's partially because of that and partially because all the weird comics they were doing, like the comics with the word weird in the title apparently sold really well at this time because they started putting out a lot. This one doesn't have weird in the title, but it kind of fits into the same group. I assume partially because of that, partially because those were becoming popular or more popular, and partially because of the Comics Code easing, but they stopped reprinting older stories, which is something that they did a lot in Volume 1. So it's a lot more new stories. They fit a lot better in with the other ones because the reprinted ones always kind of stood out and they were always a little bit goofier. These feel a little more like they're actually trying to be creepier, I guess. So I would definitely recommend checking those out. I read The Monster's Bones, The Discovery of T-Rex and How It Shook Our World, which was from 2022, written by David K. Randall. I've brought up dinosaurs a bunch of times in other videos. I like dinosaurs a lot, but I didn't know much about the discovery of T-Rex. And it turns out the author didn't either. He tells you in the intro that he decided to write this book and research this book because he didn't know anything about the subject material. And I'm going to say right now, if you're going to read a book about a topic, you don't want it to be written by somebody that doesn't know what they're talking about. So there were a lot of inaccuracies in this book on the stuff that I was familiar with, which was more like the dinosaur science side of things. There are things that are just straight up incorrect in this book. It was interesting to learn about, I assumed that the information he was getting about the people was more accurate. And it actually goes back to kind of the origins of paleontology and covers everything almost up to the present day in a way, as far as T-Rex specifically is concerned. But a large portion of the book is everything before T-Rex and kind of giving you the proper context for why T-Rex was kind of a big deal when it was discovered and how it kind of changed things. So it's not so much dealing with science and with actual dinosaurs, but is more about kind of the way paleontology, the way the kind of people that were involved with paleontology, what they were like, and kind of a little bit about what it was like to be a paleontologist at that time, which is like 1800s. I think T-Rex, I already forgot when it was discovered. It was early 20th century. It was like 1910 or something like that. But then it would take a few years before it was actually exhibited in a museum. So if you're looking for a book about T-Rex, this is not it. But it was cool to learn a little bit about some of the early paleontologists and stuff like that. And again, I assume that information is more accurate than the stuff he says about actual dinosaurs. But given that stuff was often incorrect, I wouldn't really recommend this book in general. Because if you want to learn about this kind of stuff, you're going to want to read something by somebody that is a little more knowledgeable. But I don't regret reading it. It was fine. It definitely wasn't badly written or anything. I read Bran Mac Morn, The Last King, which is a collection of stories by Robert E. Howard. So these are 1920s and 30s. Bran Mac Morn was the king of the Picts, who were a real-life race that Robert E. Howard was kind of obsessed with and created his fictional version of. By the time that Bran Mac Morn is around, the Picts have devolved into like a semi-human. It doesn't make sense from a real-life perspective, but they're all kind of like short and gnarled and weird, and they live underground. And he is the final pure-blood king or whatever, so he looks like a normal person. He's stronger and smarter than all of them, and he's basically trying to defend them from whoever else is. It's set in the time of the Roman Empire, so he's fighting the Romans sometimes. It's supposed to have like a real world context to it, but the stories do have a lot of fantasy elements. The most famous story in here is Worms of the Earth, which involves Bran going to this witch that connects him with these snake people that live underground that he uses to help fight the Romans, because the Romans are too powerful. The stories are really cool. Howard didn't write that many stories about Bran Mac Morn, so when they decided to put this book out, because this is part of a line of books by Del Rey collecting Howard stories, they didn't have enough to fill out the book. So they said, well, let's stick in some other stories that focus just on the Picts. But then it turns out that's still not enough. It's still a way thinner volume. So this book has the widest margins on the edges of the pages that I have ever seen. And it is just stupid. They should have just made it a normal book. Even the font is way bigger than any of the other books in this line. But they wanted to somehow make it look like a similar size and put it out at the same price point. So that kind of pisses me off a little bit. There is a lot of art in it by Gary Gianni. I'm not a huge fan of Gary Gianni. I don't mind his art, but I don't especially like it either. So it's cool that it's there. And even then, there still wouldn't have been nearly enough material to fill out the book. And this is something that I do really like about this line, is they put in a lot of background info. They do a lot of research, and there's a whole section just talking about Howard's writing and how he developed these stories over time, and how a lot of stuff that was happening with him and his interactions with like H.P. Lovecraft and other writers and stuff like that, and where he was drawing his material from, his inspiration, and sometimes stuff that he almost just straight up ripped off. So for someone like me who is a big fan of Robert E. Howard, it's awesome to see that kind of stuff. But for someone who was just wanting to try him out, I wouldn't recommend starting with this one. The stories that are in it are good, but a lot of them don't really have much to do with each other, and a lot of it is more background material about him. And if you're not already interested, I don't think this book is going to make you so interested that you're going to want to read all that stuff. So I would start with something else. Literally any of the other books in the line would be a better place to start. But as a fan, it is really cool. And I've been playing Skyrim, which I don't really have anything more to say from last month. I like it. I don't love it. I just discovered that I can set up a camp. I don't know how that works yet. So I have to figure that out, but that will save me a lot of frustration playing it on survival mode where I need to either enter a building or sleep to save my game. I'm not sure if there is any other way for me to save. There might be, but the way I play, I always wait until I find something like that. But if I can set up a campsite, then I can just save wherever. So that will be awesome, because this game, given that it's so open world and so much of it is outside, you spend a lot of time just traversing terrain. So it takes a long time to find a place to sleep. And given, again, that it's survival mode, it's easy to get killed by stuff along the way.
Just like real life.
Yes. And that's why I like playing these games on survival mode, because they are more realistic. But again, that's why I prefer Fallout, because it's just a more kind of real world setting, I guess, even if you have all the weird, goofy stuff and monsters and everything. I wish the dragons were a little harder to kill.
Just like real life, yeah.
Every time I would see one, I would start panicking and just being like, oh, I don't know, like, what should I do? Should I try to fight it? Because I'm going to die. Or should I, like, just run away and wait until I have better stuff? But then it turns out, no, you should fight it, because it's going to help you a lot more, and you're probably going to win. So that's a little disappointing, just because a lot of the other enemies are harder to kill and harder to fight than the dragons. They build them up so much in the game. Like, everybody is so afraid when dragons show, which is why I was so afraid, and I thought I was going to die, but it turns out they're not that hard to kill by comparison with certain other things. So I do like it. I'm just not crazy about it. And that's everything I did this month. What did you check out?
I watched a short film from 2013 called Munchausen, which was made by Ari Aster, who did Midsummer and Hereditary. And this short film has no dialogue. It is about a mom who is so attached to her college-age son that to prevent him from leaving to go to college, she poisons him. But things go too far, assuming that poisoning your children isn't already too far. And instead of just getting sick, he ends up dying. It had a good chunk of humor in it, mainly from the acting, being almost silent film-esque with exaggerated mannerisms, especially from the son. And it was good. I liked it.
Was this from before he did his movies?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure.
Okay, yeah, I remember hearing about this at some point.
I watched Apocalypto from 2006. And I didn't really know anything about this movie other than the poster, which I remembered from back in 2006. And it was around Mel Gibson's latest controversy, so everybody was talking about that. Honestly, I thought this movie was about something much bigger than it turned out to be. Not to say it was bad, it just wasn't what I was expecting. It is a story about a group of Mayans who live in the jungle, and I really liked how the beginning of the movie set it up like we were going to be following this group and the way they communicated and related to each other. But pretty close to the beginning, they're all attacked by another group who kills most of them and enslaves the rest. And the movie becomes a story of the ones who are left alive and what happens to them. There's a lot of death, a lot of suffering. It felt legit. But something I didn't like was how all of the characters were so one-dimensional. And it was even more disappointing because, again, the opening made them seem like real people who were able to do and say more than one thing. But once that opening sequence was finished, it was clear who everybody was, what their actions were going to be. It was very exaggerated. You knew nobody was going to change. And the plot, too, became very predictable. There was never any question about what was going to happen next, and the events themselves started hitting the beats of a standard Die Hard-esque action movie, despite being about a group of Mayans in the jungle. I ended up not liking it. For something that had such a strong beginning, it was disappointing. And I didn't have a problem with the major shift as the village was attacked. I really liked that twist because you thought you knew where the movie was going. I just wish the strong sense of writing had continued, even if the plot went in a different direction. It was like the people behind the movie were like, whew, that difficult job of making something compelling to watch is over. All right, let's film the other 95% of this thing. There was one really funny joke, though. So eventually people are being decapitated in order to satisfy the gods, right? And they chop off this dude's head, and it rolls down the steps of this temple to this huge crowd, and people go to grab it, and this one guy holds it up. But then this other dude snatches it away from him, and he starts whining, hey, you can't do that. That head is mine. I'm just kidding. That's not in the movie. I wish it was.
So I saw this movie back when it came out, and I remember some of the hype around it was people were saying that it was very intense and disturbing and extreme. And I went into it expecting that, and I kept thinking things were going to kind of reach a new level. It never did. I mean, I remember liking it at the time, but I mean, that was a long time ago. It wasn't what I expected because it definitely affected the way I watched it. I was always kind of uneasy thinking, like, what's going to come next? People kept talking about how extreme this movie is, and then nothing happened like that. So I don't know. It was kind of a weird experience. I do remember the scene with the panther or the leopard or whatever it was.
Chasing the one dude.
Yeah, that when they cut to close-ups of it, it's a really bad puppet. That was very distracting. I thought that stood out among the sense of realism that everything else had.
And watched Lucy from 2014, which you talked about this, right?
Oh man, not on here. I did a post on my blog back when I had a blog. I've been thinking about maybe doing like a Rust recap or something because this movie was, yeah. Well, you'll talk about it.
Yeah, this movie is terrible. And this is that one where Scarlett Johansson takes some drugs and ends up using more than 10% of her brain and then is eventually able to transcend time and space. Every step of the way was so outrageously ridiculous, but they played it 100% straight. And I haven't seen a large chunk of Luc Besson's movies. Is that how you say his name?
I think so. I don't know.
But in Leon the Professional and The Fifth Element, there's a decent amount of humor. This movie had next to none. And making an awkward statement followed by an awkward stuttering pause is not a joke. I think this movie could have benefited from more outright humor, because by both playing everything straight while simultaneously throwing out the most erroneous facts every 6 seconds, this movie completely failed to establish any sort of foothold. But I've also seen Valerian and The City of a Thousand Planets, which does have a big chunk of humor, but is such a train wreck of a film that has no idea what it's even trying to do. So I don't know. Maybe he's just on a downward slide. Hopefully Dogman turns out better.
Dogman? Is he?
Yeah, that's apparently the name of the movie he's doing next.
Is it based on the Dave Pilkey books?
I don't think so.
Oh, man. Okay.
I had to mentally reframe Lucy as a comedy, and it made much more sense that way. This is a good movie to watch with people, but after you tell them how nonsensical it's going to be.
I agree.
I watched the Super Mario Brothers movie from 2023, which is that movie that made $1 billion about that video game.
I think you should say, just for everyone out there to get the context, that you are like the biggest Nintendo fan in the world, but not in a fanboy way, in a genuine, knowledgeable way.
I like Nintendo. I like the history of Nintendo. I like the company. Yeah, being an adult, it's hard to have time to play games and stuff now, because we have real life obligations. And this movie came out in whatever month, and I was like, yeah, I'm going to wait till it streams on something I have. So it finally did. The movie felt like one set piece moving to the next. There's really no substance to the movie, and Miyamoto is very much, story isn't that important, get to the game. And this movie felt like that, except there was no game. It was a movie. There were a lot of nods to Mario stuff, Nintendo history, and I'm not going to go into that because there's always those people out there who feel they need to one-up everybody and say, oh, I'm sure I noticed things that you didn't. And, honestly, I don't care. There were a lot of Easter eggs. And I imagine the people making this movie wanted to throw in 10,000 more and were told no by Nintendo. But there was still way too much stuff in this movie. I think a good example of what they would have done had Nintendo not held them back was the music during the end credits. It was this slapped together medley of Mario music with terrible transitions and inconsistent orchestrations. It felt like they realized Nintendo had signed off on everything and went home because the movie's over. But then this dude was like, they forgot about the end credits music and I can put in all the music I want. It was really bad. The whole thing was very much a cookie cutter, current animated movie, but with a Nintendo skin on it. And I thought it was amusing that your post-credit scene was a carbon copy of the end of the 98 Godzilla movie.
Okay, explain.
Except it was a Yoshi egg instead of a Godzilla egg.
So they thought they killed all the Yoshis, but one was still alive?
Man, that would have made this movie so good. And it didn't make sense anyway, because there was a scene in the movie where there's 1,000 Yoshis all stampeding, so it's not like Yoshi wasn't in the movie. There was typical modern animation humor, no innovation on that front. Just playing everything super safe, really cliche stuff, like someone, and you can see it, you can just see it happening. Someone makes this huge speech about how they're going to stop the antagonist, and the music builds up, and at the end they shout, "Who's with me?" And then there's this silence, and someone goes, "Awkward."
Oh, jeez.
I don't think the actual line is in the movie, but it would fit seamlessly into it. That's the humor.
I'm not going to watch it. I can tell you that.
Yeah, I wouldn't expect you to watch it. I'm not going to watch it again. Visually, it looks very nice. I mean, the source material is well designed and has been refined over many years, so the only real work they had to do was animate it and not have to create it from scratch, which I'm sure saves some time. But it is exactly what you would expect. There's a lot of crap thrown in the movie, and I imagine kids watching the movie in a theater would be really loud and tugging on their parent's sleeve, being like, hey, that's from Mario Kart. And their parent would be like, what? I fell asleep.
Were there any references to the Bob Hoskins movie?
Not ones that I can think of.
I wouldn't expect there to be, but I would hope.
There were references to the 90s cartoon.
Did they have like a CGI Captain Albano in there, Lou Albano?
That would have been awesome. But I'm sure they're going to do a sequel because, again, this one made $1 billion, so why wouldn't they? I watched Suicide Squad from 2016, and I'd always heard that this movie was not very good, and that the sequel was better, and that Jared Leto's Joker was really weird and not effective, so I finally decided to sit down and watch this movie. And it was not good. It was a whole bunch of nothing. Let me summarize it for you. There's a bunch of characters who don't have any purpose, and they do stuff. And out of the entire Suicide Squad, the only effective ones are Will Smith as Deadshot and Killer Croc. And unfortunately, Killer Croc has 3 lines of dialogue, which do not include his on-screen and off-screen growls. The premise is that there's a supernatural witch threatening the world, so a group of criminals is recruited to stop her, and if they succeed, they get 10 years off their sentence. And they all have bombs implanted in their necks, so if they try and run, they are blown up. And their handler is that Brian Thompson lookalike, Joel Kinnaman.
Oh. Yeah, I guess I can see it.
And I've made that comparison before, and every time I see him, it's like they've CGI'd, youngified Brian Thompson.
Okay. I haven't heard you make that comparison before, and I wouldn't have made it myself, but now that you have, I can see it.
I think when I talked about RoboCop, I said that.
Really? Okay, I probably wasn't paying attention.
Like I said, the characters have no purpose, both in terms of being a member of the team and as a character in the movie. Will Smith is one of the only characters where they try to give him some sense of an arc. His push is to prove to his daughter that he's, quote, not a bad guy. Despite him being called Deadshot and killing countless people for money, he's not trapped in some contract, and he's not in a situation where he has something held above him, like the safety of his family. He does it, quote, because he likes to do it, which kind of conflicts with his motivation of not being a bad guy. And at the end of the movie, when they succeed, he gets to visit his daughter, and they're doing her math homework together, and they're discussing the hypotenuse of a triangle, and she says, so when you shoot someone from the top of a building, this is how far the bullet goes before it hits him on the street? And they both laugh and laugh.
What? Does that really happen?
Yes.
Oh, man.
The only character who actually had a glimpse of development was El Diablo, who in the past killed his wife and children with his explosive flame powers when he got upset. So he has vowed to not use his powers ever again, but they stick him on the team, and he eventually does use his powers, and he sacrifices himself, which was nice. But he barely gets any screen time at all, outside of the 2 minutes to tell his backstory and the 30 seconds when he kills himself. So that was a missed opportunity in a movie that should have roped in every opportunity when it had the chance, because the movie was terrible. Nobody else mattered, despite Harley Quinn, Killer Croc, Slipknot, Katana, and Captain Boomerang being on the team. And the most useless member of the team was Harley, even though Margot Robbie was pretty much the face of this movie in all the marketing. She walks around with a baseball bat. She approaches and attacks demon people and demigods with a baseball bat, which, not surprisingly, is not very effective. It reminded me of the first Avengers movie when the aliens are all attacking New York, and it does that montage of all the heroes using their superpowers. You know, Captain America's chucking his shield, Thor's using his god hammer, and it finishes with Black Widow firing some pistols in random directions, like it's actually doing something. Harley also has the subplot of the Joker trying to find and rescue her, which felt like a completely different movie that attached itself onto this one like a big plot leech. It had nothing to do with anything, and anytime he showed up, nothing really happened. It didn't even feel like it was trying to lead into anything else. Like, at the end, Ben Affleck does the post-credit thing where he's like, I'm forming the Justice League. While silly, it was leading to something. The Joker stuff started and ended nowhere. And while people said Leto's Joker was too weird and too experimental and whatnot, I found him incredibly boring and bland. It just wasn't interesting. The writer/director of this movie has stated that he's disappointed with Suicide Squad, and it didn't feel like the movie that we hoped we were going to make. Talking like it was somebody else's responsibility. But he wrote and directed it. It wasn't good. And now he's riding on the coattails of Zack Snyder's Justice League thing, where he claims that a director's cut will redeem him. And, quote, everybody he's talked to is in full support of the release. Which is probably people who would just get more money if they released the movie again. So, I mean, if I were in that crew, I'd say yeah. And when Warner Brothers said they're not going to release any kind of director's cut, he asked on social media, quote, why? Like they have a personal vendetta against him or something, instead of being a giant multi-billion-dollar machine that puts out tons of crap every year, doesn't give a shit about one dude whining about how things aren't fair. Your movie sucked. Get over it. And looking at his track record, it looks like things are all over the map in terms of quality and reception. So it's not like he only hit home runs and this movie is the outlier. I think the dumbest part of Suicide Squad was the relationships, that's in quotes, that characters build, and that's in quotes, over the course of less than an hour. These hardened, ruthless killers who don't give a shit about anything or anybody are literally hugging each other by the end of the movie and doing slow motion smiles and nods like they all really respect each other and they're all in this together. So I followed up by watching The Suicide Squad, which was from a few years later in 2021, and it was much more successful because it didn't take itself seriously, whereas the 2016 one most definitely did. I mean, this was James Gunn after being fired from Marvel, and DC basically said, wait, why don't we just do our own Guardians of the Galaxy, but with the characters we have? And why don't we just hire the dude who just did those movies and got fired because he's looking for a job? So it felt like Guardians of the Galaxy with DC characters. And the Harley Quinn character worked much better here because it focused on her character traits and her personality, not her abilities. Because, again, she has no abilities other than swinging a baseball bat. It was a much better movie than the first one. It was more watchable, for sure. I watched Superman from 1978. There's so much going on in this movie, it just hits beat after beat after beat without really giving any time to explore any of it, and then the movie is over. It asks the viewer to accept everything as soon as it's presented, and that was a little jarring. The whole movie is very surface level. Not to say it's bad, it's just you must accept it as presented.
Well, I feel like the thinking was that people already know all of the stuff that they're going to see in the movie. They already know Superman. Like you're saying, people already know the story.
Right, but that makes it a little more odd that they chose to tell this story that everybody already knows.
Yeah, I could see that perspective. I think it was more just the idea of seeing it on a big screen and all that, in a big movie.
They already saw it in the 50s. They had a whole TV show.
Uh-huh.
For example, the instant Clark shows up to work at the Daily Planet, and he's like, hey, I'm Clark Kent. And he immediately is deeply in love with Lois the first time he sees her. And they literally just met 10 seconds prior. But again, as people who are familiar with Superman, we're like, oh yeah, Superman loves Lois Lane.
I will say that Margot Kidder, she makes a good Lois Lane in the sense that her Lois Lane is a huge bitch, just like she was in the Silver Age, but I absolutely cannot stand her in that movie.
The Lex Luthor plot is there, and he outright states what he wants to do and how he wants to do it, and it's because he's the greatest criminal mind of our time. That's it. It's taking the sensibilities of the 50s show and presenting it as a movie in 1978, which is not the approach they had to take, to pretty much ignore everything that had happened and was happening in the comics. But that was probably the right decision, because in the 70s, Superman comics were weird. And it was probably also a good decision that they didn't stick in a bunch of 70s real-world culture stuff, because nothing dates your movie like dating your movie. The whole thing was just this big whirlwind running at a breakneck pace. It was hard to get invested in any of it, and the only part that went on at length was Superman taking Lois on their romantic flight. And that scene went on for what felt like 40 minutes. It was exhausting. They have huge shots where they just look lovingly at each other, but it happens like 8 times during that sequence. And I followed up with Superman 2, which was 1980, and I haven't seen that one in years.
The theatrical version or the Richard Donner cut?
I'll get to that. This is the one where everyone goes, oh yeah, that's the one where Superman fights General Zod, and everyone seems to hold it in higher regard than the first one. But General Zod doesn't even show up for real until well past the midpoint, and this was the theatrical version, so the pacing was horrible. There are huge stretches that do not, for any reason, need to be huge stretches. This is probably the most relaxed and casual superhero movie I have ever seen. Everyone, both regular people and super people, move so sluggishly and pretty much just meander around. Nobody seems to care about anything that's going on. Even during the fight between Superman and the Kryptonians in the middle of the city, people are just kind of milling around on the street. Some of them aren't even paying attention, and the ones that are acting more curious than anything, even though this is after the president addressed the whole world, saying Zod was in charge of the planet. He had already destroyed multiple locations, and they're dropping buildings on people.
And some of that is the, in my opinion, failed attempts at humor.
Yeah.
With the way people react to everything.
Yeah, it was weird. And Zod's mentality for a lot of it is, I'm so bored with everything that's going on. And I was like, yeah, me too. Superman himself is also out of character compared to the first movie. So he reveals to Lois that he's Superman, and then turns into an awkward 12-year-old boy who has his crush over for dinner. And I get what they were going for, but it was way too much, and it doesn't match how he was in the first movie at all. Bumbling, stuttering, and nervous, that is Clark Kent. But once he becomes Superman, he's charismatic, confident, and bold. And he remains that way all the time, even with Lois in the first movie. In fact, Lois is the one who turns into a starstruck, speechless schoolgirl. And I don't get why the people making this movie decided to swap their romance behaviors. If anything, at that point, they should both be confident, charismatic, and bold. That would have made more sense and a better relationship between them. I also thought Margot Kidder was a good choice for Lois Lane. And for what the first movie set up, feeling like the old Superman show, I thought Christopher Reeve was a good Superman casting choice. It was just his character in this movie needed work, and he is not the only one. Zod and his gang are overly childish. Zod comes down to Earth, and he lands in a river, and he just makes this comment about how water is weird, and he acts like it's the entire surface of the Earth because that's where he landed. It's fucking water. And the other two landed 5 feet away on dirt. And then a police car pulls up to them, and they're fascinated by the emergency lights on it. They've never seen a light before. It's a fucking light bulb. And they even talk like children. They look at the light, and I think it's Zod. He's like, that is red, like our sun on Krypton. So colors are... They need to get some speaking spells in the Phantom Zone.
You say red. Red is the color of the sun. You say little bitch, because it's what you are, Zod. Jor-El rules. Zod rules.
This was the theatrical version, so Richard Donner was fired during production, and that might be the main reason why I didn't enjoy this movie. And Donner is not the only one who left. A bunch of people were replaced behind the scenes, and some people in front of the camera refused to come back. So throughout the movie, there are scenes shot years after the original shooting, with a different crew and sometimes different actors, so it's really inconsistent. The beginning and the ending is completely different, and the theatrical version, those scenes feel like they belong in a Silver Age Superman comic and not one of the good ones. There are entire sequences just kind of shoved in there, and the director that replaced Donner was Richard Lester. And from what I found, I don't understand why they chose this guy and his style to replace Richard Donner. It seems like they could not be farther apart, and he ended up directing Superman 3, if that tells you anything. I haven't seen the Donner cut, have you?
I have not. I own it, but I've never seen it.
I want to. It sounds better, and this movie was clearly trying to expand from the first one in pretty much every way, but my fear is that too much of what I didn't like in this one is still in the Donner cut. I guess we'll see.
And I'm just going to say I clearly like both of these movies a lot more than you do. I like them a lot. And that includes Superman 2, even if I've only seen the theatrical cut. I do have problems with it, but the things that work for me work well enough that I still really like it.
That's interesting, because I wouldn't expect you to like the second one. Maybe you're just fascinated by the color red and the light bulbs.
You talk about certain scenes kind of going on for a long time, and I agree, but for some reason with that movie, they kind of pull me in. I don't know. There's something about it.
I watched Evil Dead Rise from 2023. Have you seen this one?
I have not.
Okay, this takes place in an urban, condemned apartment building where a mother and her 3 kids are just struggling to survive. And her sister unexpectedly shows up, and aside from the demons possessing people and eating glass and vomiting in people's faces, there's an element of them trying to bond as a family, which actually worked. What have you heard about this one?
Nothing special. It sounded kind of generic to me, and it looked kind of generic. I honestly didn't pay too much attention, though. I didn't look into it at all because I was not interested.
It was competently made. The only thing I didn't really like was some of the kid acting. It had enough nods to the other ones, some of them dumb, but they didn't get in the way of the movie. It stood on its own. So there were no cabins, no woods in this one. They took the old Poltergeist 3 approach and said, let's just do it in a building. There were some things that I liked that typically don't happen in movies like this. So the one kid finds a recording of someone chanting the incantations and whatever, and he tries to turn it off, which I noticed in pretty much all the other movies, nobody tries to turn it off.
That's a good point.
But the demons actually prevent him from doing it. So I was on that kid's side, for that part at least. But yeah, I think you should watch it. It was worth watching. And there's enough gross stuff in there too.
Okay. And there's nothing else in between that and the remake, right? Other than like Ash vs. Evil Dead or whatever.
Yeah. I watched Tetsuo the Iron Man from 1989. This is the movie that put Shinya Tsukamoto on the map. And I talked about his earlier one, The Adventure of Denshu Kozo, last month. But Tetsuo is much more popular. And Denshu Kozo is actually what's playing on the TV for some of the shots in this movie. Tsukamoto is basically Cronenberg, Lynch, and Raimi, but in Japan. So the plot is this dude hits someone with his car, which sucks, but it gets worse because the dude he hit is this machine fetishist, and they're both infected with this techno-organic virus that starts turning them into part man, part machine, which is a common theme in Tsukamoto's work. And the main dude has to deal with it, and his girlfriend has to deal with it, and it's an overall very weird experience. Something I really liked in the first half that was kind of lost was the lighting. Once everything started being really well lit, it detracted from the effect of his transformation. And Tsukamoto intentionally made this movie in black and white, which was a good choice. But again, once the intentional lighting decisions were lost, the starkness and effectiveness of the imagery was lost. And that might have had something to do with the production history. They kept losing people during production. Tsukamoto was apparently a little contentious to work with. They only had the funds to do single takes. Some of the cast and crew assumed that the movie was a parody as they were making it, so they were really over-exaggerating with their acting, which actually kind of works to the movie's benefit. He ran out of money at one point. The whole thing sounded like a complete mess. I think by the end it was just him and the main guy, the main actor, to finish the movie. It is definitely worth a watch. It's really highly regarded. It's a very energetic, hectic movie. You just have to know what you're heading into. And I have the second one too. I'm interested to seeing how that one turned out. And I know he made a third one in the 2000s, but I don't ever hear too much about that. Have you seen either of the ones after the first one?
No, I've only seen the first one, and I remember not liking it. I remember being pretty indifferent, I guess, and just being like, oh, okay, I guess I saw that. But that was a long time ago. Maybe I should check it out again.
A lot of the stop motion stuff reminded me of Evil Dead.
Okay, see, I don't even remember stop motion stuff, so maybe I should check it out.
And I think it was really effective in this one too, because it's, during things transforming, lots of wires and whatever.
Okay.
I watched Raging Bull from 1980, which is a Martin Scorsese movie with Robert De Niro. So, those haven't happened very much. De Niro is a boxer who's a little bit crazy and later becomes more than a little bit crazy. He's a very one-track mind. He really only listens to himself, despite everyone around him telling him he's making bad decisions. And he's a really good boxer, too. This was Joe Pesci's first big break movie, and his personality is pretty much what you'd expect. He's not as vicious as the later movies, and he's actually the voice of reason more often than not, which was kind of amusing, because De Niro's the crazy one. Kathy Moriarty got her start here, too, before eventually reaching her crowning career achievement of Casper. And this was going to be Scorsese's last film before he decided it wasn't going to be his last film. And he paid a lot of attention to the editing. And it actually won an Oscar for editing. And I read that this was the first boxing movie to put the camera in the ring, because Scorsese said he wanted the camera to be a contender during the fight. And if that's true, that's awesome. And it was really well done. I don't know if that's true, though, if it was the first time Characters are typical Scorsese characters, but they are very one-dimensional and have way less depth than later Scorsese movie characters, to the point where it was getting pretty tired to hear the same characters say the same things in the same way for the entire movie. The whole movie feels very raw. Later stuff like Goodfellas, Casino, they're so slick and they have such a stylized flow. But this one, probably because it's earlier, feels much grittier. Like the whole thing is just kind of grinding its way forward, if that makes sense. And I watched a bunch of DC Showcase animated shorts from 2020. There were 5, and they were different styles, different writers, different directors, but they were all pretty good. So there was a Sergeant Rock one, an Adam Strange, a Phantom Stranger, Death from Sandman, and a retelling of Batman Death in the Family. And they were good. They were very short, and just these tiny little standalone stories.
I'm very surprised at that selection of characters, that they would go with some of those.
This is the second compilation, so I haven't seen the first one, but it probably maybe has more commonplace characters. Yeah, I was so pumped when I realized the one was the Phantom Stranger one, because Phantom Stranger is awesome.
Yeah, that sounds cool.
And I don't know if they are based on comic stories or if they are original stories, but regardless, they were pretty good. I mean, I know Death in the Family is based on that Batman comic. And I played Donut Dodo from 2023, which is an arcade game made in the style of 80s arcade games, so Donkey Kong type stuff. And it's really good. I actually bought it because I heard the soundtrack and I said, I'm going to check this game out. So I watched some videos on it and I said, I'm going to buy that. And it was on sale too, so win-win. It's 5 stages, and the goal is just to collect all of the donuts before you get the big donut held by a giant dodo. So very typical 80s arcade feel, because that's the kind of stuff that would be in arcades at that time. And there's a points game, so you can get them all, or you can get them in a specific order to build up your combo, go for a high score. And at the beginning, it was arcade difficult, where it was frustrating, but every time you died, it was your fault. But then as you play more and learn the patterns, it gets much easier, and it was fun. It was really fun. I know if you play the actual arcade version, because there's that arcade thing, I think it's Arcadia something, but they actually put in a 6th level just for that, which is kind of neat. But I mean, where the hell are those? But it's a good game, very well made. It's just one guy, and then another guy did the music. I would recommend it if you're just looking for a quick arcade experience. And that's all I did this month. So we are done with 2023.
About time. It wasn't the previous one that I mentioned, Japan, right?
Yes, we get it. You're going to Japan.
I'm not bragging. I just want to make sure that people are aware of a new reason for delays in these videos.
Yeah, as opposed to our existing one, which is we're busy.
Yeah. Regardless, thanks to everyone for your support, your continued viewing, and listening to our crap.
Yep. So hopefully your 2024 shapes up to be a good year.
I can't tell if you're talking to me or the audience, but I agree.
Thanks for watching.